Hello, I'm Julie Hay, and as you can see from what's on the screen, I'm going to be talking about the training of transactional analysts. I'm going to make some assumptions that you're going to be somewhat familiar with this, so that what I'm going to be doing is sharing some of my thinking about how this happens, what some of the considerations are, what some of the issues are. And I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about my background so that you understand where I'm coming from. I'm a TSTA, which is a Teaching and Supervising Transactional Analyst, and I am that in the organizational field of application, psychotherapy, and educational field. There's one other field internationally, which is counseling. And I'm actually now a signed up trainee to take my exam in that, with the intention of eventually I'll be a teaching and supervising transactional analyst in all of the fields that are available. And you'll see as I go through why I think that might be important. I'm also a doctoral candidate where I'm looking at the dynamics of professional associations. And one of those is the European TA Association, where over the years I've had lots of contact, including having been the president of that and ITAA. And I'm also doing some other research about the similarities and differences in helping professions. And again, you'll see as I carry on talking why that is significant in the way I approach the whole idea of training transactional analysts. For those of you who may not already know, there's the European and the International Association. They work very much together so that they keep things as closely as possible the same. And they recognize 4 areas of application, as I've already said. Now, the significant one is counseling at the moment is a bit of a problem. It's being used increasingly to refer to coaching. The way it's described does talk about helping people with problem management. So it fits coaching. The trouble is it also fits things like bereavement counselling, counselling people when they have cancer or they've got some serious illness. It then becomes arguable whether if you're coaching someone within an organization, are you the organizational field or are you the coaching as counseling field? And equally, if you're a school counselor, are you more a counselor or are you somebody who ought to understand the educational environment? What I've found is that the competencies, although they're described quite differently, to my mind, they're the same. And what I've done is combined them. I actually cut them all up into little strips and sorted them out and found it was fairly easy to group them under some different headings. And then I've actually mapped those headings across to at least a couple of universities where they issue competencies for helping professionals. And it does seem to me that we're all working with much the same thing. The ones I've come up with are these. Personal attributes about being okay, reflecting on yourself and others, generally working in a way that we would consider meant that you were a sort of good person. Then there are the competencies of working within different professional contexts. That would be your own or your client's professional context as well. Theory. Fairly obviously, you do need to know how to apply the TA theories. Relationship, can you actually form good relationships with clients? Can you contract with clients? Because contracting is, after all, a very significant TA approach. And then, how well do you analyze and assess what your clients' needs are, what their issues are, and so on? How well do you then design and plan what it is you're going to do with your client? How competently do you then implement that plan? And also, all the way through this, how are you evaluating the impact of your practice? How are you evaluating what's going on? I see on the translation that this is the same word as was used when I talked about analysing and assessing. Obviously, in English, we've got more words usually. What I mean by the analysing and assessing is more like a diagnosis. What I mean by evaluation or on its own is more that you step back and you get some feedback and you work out how can you check that what you're doing is having the impact you expect at a micro and at a macro level. So how do you actually monitor what's happening for your clients? Now, I'll explain later as well that the program I run has certain modules. They're things like focusing on individual development or focusing on groups. So for each of those, it seems to me it's possible to pull out some specific competencies which tend to be either cognitive. You need to know certain parts of the TA theory really well to do this piece of work. Not necessarily know everything of TA theory. And then the skills as well. What particular skills do you need when you're doing some particular types of work? So that's my approach to the competencies, on the basis that, okay, the way you show them in terms of evidence might vary depending on which context you work in, but we're all actually using the same competencies, which is of a transactional analyst. Now, philosophy, the underlying philosophy, I think, for TA training. You'll notice there, I don't say I'm okay, you're okay. I've sort of backed off that a bit because it's become too much like a religious mantra. It also gets people confused because they don't seem to always pick up that it's meant to be an attitude. Burns said it was an existential position, and they think it means how you behave. And then the problem is, if you go around believing everybody will behave in an okay way, it just doesn't work out. So I tend to prefer to just say, there's me, there's you. We need to respect diversity. We're all different. All the different ways in which we vary, we need to respect that if we want to be transactional analysts. And we need to do that about our students. Physis. Byrne talked about physis as that urge within people to grow to their own potential in all living things. So plants will grow to the sun. You put concrete over them, they'll grow through the cracks, they'll come around the edges. And I think people are like that. They want to grow and develop. Metaphorically, it's as if we poured some concrete over them when they were children. And I sometimes think our role is to come along with the pickaxe and make some cracks so that then their own physis force will mean that they grow. We can think and we can make decisions. So the fact that we can all think and therefore we can think differently and redecide. Another part of the philosophy is autonomy and then having a developmental script. When I was first learning TA, autonomy was seen as the opposite of script. Script was all bad. It meant that you just lived out this story that you'd chosen when you were little and now didn't remember. But then along came Finita English and some other people who said that you need something because otherwise you don't know your identity. You wake up in the morning and you don't know who you are. So I now tend to think about having a developmental script, which means you chose it, you could update it, versus having a deterministic script, which means that you actually believe that there's only one way you can behave. And then finally, philosophically, we are helping our students when we train them to be more curious, to know how to reflect. so that they become increasingly more aware of themselves and more aware of what's happening for other people. And also to be critical, to critique things, so that they don't just say, oh, isn't TA wonderful, and this idea of strokes is so wonderful, and so on. That they do actually look and think, well, it may be really good in some places, but it will have limitations or it can be misused, so that they actually do take a critical view when they're learning the TA, instead of just accepting that all of it is wonderful. That's the philosophy. I also think about our maps of the world. And within TA, we have some really interesting ideas that are directly about what map of the world are we operating with. So, constructivism, this idea that we construct our world. So we look out and we actually invent it each time. Unfortunately, we often invent it in the same way we did invent it the last time. So the ideas around constructivism are really valuable to know that when we help people learn TA, we're helping them to construct their world differently. Co-creativity, also this recognition that we do this together. We're in contact with each other, we're human beings. So even now as I'm speaking, we're co-creating, because I'm saying certain things, something goes on in your brain based on what you've already got there, and then something gets created there, which is now different to what it was before you listened to me. Now, we don't actually have any opportunity to talk to each other in a normal circumstance. You could then be asking me questions, and that would co-create things in my brain as well. At the moment, I'm having to sort of do that myself by just imagining what you might ask, which is not quite the same thing. Discounting, I often teach this as the secret of the universe. Wonderful TA concept. We don't know what we don't know. We need another to help us notice. It's discounting is how we stay sane, because we can't pay attention to everything, but it's also how we create problems, because we construct the world in line with what we've already decided, and we don't know what we're overlooking. And then I think of the permission and protection ideas in TA that Pat Crossman wrote about as really interesting as a map of the world. What we're doing when we're training is we're giving permission for people to learn and grow and develop and to become competent professionals. I don't mean that we're just saying you have permission. I mean we're creating an environment which is permissive in the sense that you can do this, but we also have a responsibility to make sure that we have taken into account necessary protection. We don't let students go off and use some techniques which might backfire on them, for example. We talk a lot about making sure you have a good contract and you stay within the contract. We also even think about if we're presenting some potentially distressing material, we need the protection of making sure that they're okay, they're going to be okay with that. So these are all TA concepts which I think they certainly help me to think about my map of the world in terms of how I'm doing the training. Now, what I'm also going to talk about a bit is the sort of paradigms of education that are available. You'll see I've spread this over two PowerPoints because there are too many of them. If I try to put all 6 of them on one, the letters get a bit too small. And I'll describe them first, and then I'm going to go back and talk about why they're useful and where their pitfalls are. So, dogmatic, these are not necessarily TA names. They're written about within TA, but these are labels that are used generally when people look at educational models. Dogmatic is about the teaching where you have to learn the right way to do things. You have to learn what the standards and the norms are. Behavioral is about, the focus is on, you're going to develop skills and competence and standards of excellence. And then traditional paradigm of education is a bit like the academic version. There's some knowledge that needs to be passed from the teacher to the student. So you teach them the theory and pass the knowledge on. That's 3 of them. The other 3, progressive, where the assumption there is that students are resourceful and the teacher is a guide. Humanistic is where the focus is on facilitating personal development. It's existentialist. It's about, okay, we need to help the student develop personally, and from that they'll get whatever they need. And then radical, which of course originated in South America, so I'm guessing some of you are maybe more familiar with that than me, developing critical consciousness. So those are 6 different ways of thinking about what education is about, what it should be doing. If we now go on to look at the pluses and minuses, the dogmatic, great because it gives people a structure and boundaries. The danger is it becomes the orthodox approach so that people feel they have to do it that way. With the behavioral, useful because people do learn skills, they learn competencies. The danger I see then is that they clone. They think they have to exhibit their skills and competencies in the way that their trainer or their guru did. So you just get little clones of different trainers all doing the same thing. The traditional, great because it does ensure that people get a robust theoretical basis to what they're doing. But the problem then is there may be no innovation. I have even heard people say sometimes, oh no, what Eric Byrne meant when he wrote that was this. As if, you know, there's only one way you can learn this theory and you mustn't change anything. Now, for the rest of them, the progressive, that's great that the students initiate the learning. They'll be more motivated. They'll know what they want to learn. But the problem is they may miss pieces. They don't actually know what there is that they could be learning. Humanistic, useful because the students do change. And that's particularly important for TA because we as a person are our tool of our profession. But what I can see sometimes is happening is they get to be much too inward looking. So then you read what a student has written about a piece of work they've done, and you suddenly realize it's all about how did I feel, what happened to me, what was my counter-transference and so on. And they appear to have forgotten that they're also supposed to be thinking about the client and what was going on for them. And then the radical, great because it's about genuine change, it's about encouraging autonomy, different ways of looking at the world. The danger I see sometimes with that is that the TA gets picked up more like a religion. People do say, this has had such an impact on me, everybody else has to have it. That actually puts other people off because they are acting as if this is the only way to be. Now, the main elements of training, again, I'm looking at this from ITAA and the European TA Association, but it's also the way I run my program. Training by a qualified person. You must be applying it. You can't learn this as something theoretical. You've got to be using it to help other people to develop if you want to say you've learned to be a TA practitioner of some kind. Supervision, i.e. helping you, I think of this as take a super vision of your practice. So helping you get a meta perspective of what you're doing, again, by a qualified TA person. Professional development, because I would be quite worried if somebody literally just came and learned TA and never did anything else to develop themselves. And then the idea that you have a principal supervisor or a sponsor, so that you don't just keep going to different people for supervision. You have one person that you get quite a lot from, not all, but quite a lot, because you need that to pick up any themes that you may not be noticing, which don't get picked up if you just go and see various different people. So that's the sort of the elements, useful TA concepts when we're thinking about how we are training people in TA. Permission and protection, which I've already mentioned. We need to think about how do we create permission within our training and supervision environments so that people can talk about their weaknesses and where they've done something wrong. And how do we provide protection? That might be to stop them going and doing something that would have a negative outcome. That might also be about protecting them in the terms of everything is confidential, maybe even letting them know that they should anonymize client names, organization names, and so on, unless they're in a small group where they know it will be kept as confidential. Contracting, really, really useful. And when we look at the training, we're also having a contract, and it's also multi-party, because it's not just the trainer and the student. There's the association, there may be the training institute, and then implicitly there are also clients involved in this. There may be other professional bodies and so on. Discounting, as I've already mentioned, really useful to think about. And I've taken, if you're familiar with the discount matrix that was developed originally by Jackie Schiff and co., I've taken the treatment levels and put them into a series of 6 steps, which makes it a bit easier to understand. If you get interested on that, you could follow it up. Working styles is my name for the positive end of drivers, those characteristic ways of behaving where we think we're only okay if we do them. I pick out the strengths from that because I focus on positive psychology. So that then relates into how people will learn, which relates into, as a trainer, I need to make sure I don't only teach for my style. And then the doors to contact, TA concept, are really useful to think about what's the best way to make contact with students in the different styles. And then the fact that the group needs to be a community of learning. So we need to think about group imagoes, Byrne's idea that we have this mental image. And also, if we don't think about it, we will try to recreate our family of origin. And we need some help not to do that, unless our family of origin happen to be a wonderful learning community. Now, if I now think about what happens when we're doing the training, I just want to mention a few things about some of the common problems, common issues that I've seen happening. For example, regression to school days. If we make the training environment anything like looking like a school, then people will think they're back at school. They'll go back into child ego state, regress, and so on. It's not conducive to them learning as a grown-up. I've also seen problems where people get very distressed when they do check-ins. It's fairly common to say to people, you know, all check in, say to each other, where are you? Is there anything worrying you? Excuse me, I've just touched my keyboard. Let me just move back. Yep, that is the right one. It's all right. It takes me a moment to think about the language switch. In English, we have a saying that if something really annoys us, we say, it gets my goat. Presumably on the basis that we then act like a goat, which is not a good way to be behaving. Years ago, there was a counselling trainer who used to say to people, when you come on my workshops, please will you tie up your goats outside, leave them there, don't bring them in the room, and then you can collect them when you leave if you really still want them. So for me, there's something about setting things up in such a way that somebody doesn't come, do a check-in, get really upset with what they've shared, and then they can't learn. Reactions to the material. I mentioned earlier about protection. If we're going to be teaching something like, for example, trauma, we need to give some warnings that people might have an impact, a reaction to it. We also need to ensure that they've got some support, either there or some cases, that they do have a therapist or somebody they can go to if the TA material starts to generate issues for them. And then the other thing I've already mentioned about learning styles linked to drivers. One of the potential issues there would be that people get a bit stressed and they move into their driver. And that's where we need to know the best way to get contact with them and help them move on past that. Now, that's the potential issues in the training. Potential issues when they're practicing or associated with practice. One of them is they can't find any clients. Now, in a lot of psychotherapy programs, it's easier to find places to practice. There are placements that people can get. There are counselling centres. Sometimes the training institute actually runs its own. Or there are local centres and so on that are always keen to get students to come and work with them because then they don't have to pay them. The student gets the experience, the clients have someone to see, and there are supervisors there keeping an eye on it. With the people I work with, when it's not psychotherapy, I do need to make sure that they understand I can't find clients for them. I can't find schools for them to work in or organizations for them to go into. I don't find them coaching clients. So before they begin the training, I do always have a discussion about how will you find the clients, because you can't get the TA qualification without practicing using it with people. Another issue is that the workshop, the training environment, is not the same as the real world. So it might be fine that you practice with other students, but they do need to be alerted to the fact that, yes, but these are students who are learning the same TA you are, so there's something different in their heads already. When you talk to clients, they won't act like your other students act. So you do need to find ways of practicing in fairly sort of safe environments as you begin, and don't expect all your clients to respond like your colleagues do on the training course. The other thing is, going back to when I talked about the competencies, helping people realize that during their practice, they do need to think about how can they evaluate at least 5 points. They need to evaluate during the work that they're doing, the process, while they're sitting there with the client. They need to learn to be analyzing what's happening. They might also need to find ways that they dialogue with the client about that. At the end of the session, they need to be evaluating what's happened and whether it was useful. Shortly afterwards, when the client is back in their normal circumstances, you need some way of finding out from the client how that went. And also the impact on others that the client is in contact with. And then the ultimate is, can they maintain whatever they've learned over time? So those are potential issues when people are practicing, that they need help to think, you're going to need to do this when you get out there and start acting like an analyst. Then in supervision, there's obviously, for some people, a lot of shame and embarrassment when they realize they're supposed to come and talk about what didn't go well. So they're busy getting embarrassed because they think they made a mistake. You have to help them realize that, no, the way we learn is to analyze what we've done and keep thinking, how could I have done that in other ways, and better quite often. Another issue that I notice comes up is that students select what they bring for supervision. So they may not bring things if they think it was too big a problem. And then, of course, they don't get the help where they really need it. There are issues around having a description rather than an actual recording. I'm a real fan of, you don't know what you're missing if you don't listen to a recording. When you do listen to a recording, you notice all sorts of things that you were not conscious of at the time. So if our supervision is always done on them telling us what happened, it's going to miss a lot of things. Parallel process, SERLs, not a TA concept. It's a shame that, because it's wonderful. If you haven't come across it, this is the idea that human relationships run in parallel. So if the client talks about maybe their colleague or partner, and they say, well, they really don't listen to me, the danger is the therapist or the practitioner starts thinking, this client really doesn't listen to me. And when they go for supervision, the supervisor thinks, this practitioner really doesn't listen to me. You get the parallel. It's a weird process. It just seems to happen. So as supervisors, we need to be alert to that and look at how could we change it so that some positive process goes back down the chain. Symbiosis, TA concept, Schiff. This idea that the danger is supervisor is the mummy or the daddy and the student is the child. That can come from either end, of course. So we need to watch out that we don't think we're a parent to our students, but they also need to be helped not to see us as a substitute parent figure. And then the clash of the functions. There are various words used for this. I quite like the idea that it's the normative, the formative, and the supportive. We need to help them learn the norms of the profession. We need to help them develop and grow themselves and learn to be a better analyst. And we need to support them when they might need encouraging. They can clash. So you want to support them and encourage them, but you need to tell them they're doing something wrong and it's unethical and they should stop it. Or you want them to be very open with you so that you know where their learning needs are, but at the same time, that might mean you have to tell them that they've done something which is outside the norms of the profession, so they don't want to tell you. So that's one of the other potential problems with supervision, is how do we juggle these different functions that we need to be carrying out. Now, in terms of the program I've done, it leads to a master's and also to the Certified Transactional Analyst qualification. I sort of run them alongside. I include options for a certificate and a diploma. That means that when you're about a quarter of the way through, which might be a year or so, if you dropped out, then you could at least still get a certificate. And then if you do a 50%, couple of years through, you could get a diploma. I've done that because I found a lot of people give up before they've gone all the way through and they've got nothing. And it's also meant to be an encouragement that, like, you've got this far, you may as well keep on going. I work with multi-levels. So what I mean by that is I have beginners and advanced altogether, because I say that there are only so many TA concepts. We go over them, we look at them from different angles. The first time you hear a concept, you apply it to yourself. When you hear it the next time, you're thinking about relationships with other people. By the third time, you're now thinking about how you're using that as a practitioner. If you're still there for the fourth time, you're getting ready to take an exam and show other people that you've understood it and can use it. And the way I do it is workshops, webinars. I run a lot of international webinars, summer schools, particularly because I do say to people, fine to have a webinar because you have no TA trainer in your country, but you do need to come together with other people to really learn TA. You can't just learn it sitting on your own. I also encourage them to study on the webinar in a group as well somewhere. And then I run TA909s, which is my fun label, so that it's the opposite end to a TA101. There's TA101s for beginners, TA909s are for the very advanced people who are getting ready to take their exams. In terms of the syllabus, I draw on all the schools of TA. I'm not going to just read all those out. You can see them there. The last one is what I call the school I run, developmental, which could be defined by saying it's anything that's not psychotherapy. What it actually means is it's all those issues, all those applications where we're working to develop people rather than to cure them. So organizational, educational. I sometimes think of that as we're working with the walking wounded, like they get up every day, they go to work, they go to school and so on. They've got hang-ups like we all have, but they want to grow and develop. They're not coming and saying, I need to be cured. So all of those, obviously, though, have really useful concepts that we need to know. I also think it's a shame that the fields have got separate. When I learned, which started back in the 70s, I trained alongside psychotherapists, and we all learned more about what each other was doing. And I work hard now to help people still pay attention to that. It's too easy to overlook it if you all train separately. Each year, I tend to go through roughly a syllabus which is about how do you do professional interventions. That might be thinking about contracting and ethics and so on. Then, what are the concepts we've got about how individuals get developed? Then, what about interactions and relationships? And then, what goes on in groups, including leadership, and obviously groups could be families or teams or classrooms. Then, what happens in organizations and institutions? And that spreads across into thinking about the contexts in which we work, but also in context for the client. And then probably wrapping up the year with some more on professional and process skills. So back more directly into how do you perform as a transactional analyst? You need to be analyzing. Okay, in supervision, you'll see the one in color is the one I prefer. So we can do supervision one-to-one in private. We can do it with an audience who are just watching, and they do learn from watching. We can do it in a group where the group do the supervision. But what I found there is the danger is each member of the group has their own hypothesis. So unless they're a fairly advanced group, the poor supervisee gets pulled in different directions. And we can also have peer supervision, which again can be very useful, but they may all be discounting in the same way. They may lack perceptions because they only know the same things. They may overlook things. My preference is to do one-to-one, but with an audience, and then the audience stays silent, analyze as we go, and we follow it with what I call a process review. What that means is the supervisee sits quietly and just listens, so they don't get drawn into the work again and they don't have to justify anything. But the group then challenge me if necessary, ask me questions. They actually unpick the process of the supervision. So they learn a lot, and actually often I learn a lot because they'll pick up things that I haven't noticed. So that seems to me to be the best way of doing supervision when it can be done. Outputs of the program that I run. People have to produce a learning journal over 8 months. They have to do this at the beginning. They don't have to keep on doing it, although we do suggest they might find it really useful to do. And we assess how are they learning and how are they using that knowledge. They have to do some portfolios of evidence. Basically, they produce their working papers for an intervention with a client, and then they do a TA-based reflective commentary on what happened. Now, because I'm working internationally, the evidence can be in any language. I don't require they translate it all. I might occasionally go back and ask for a translation of something, but generally, it's the commentary does need to be in English. But the evidence they attach to it doesn't have to be. It's like quite often we can look at something in another language anywhere, and if we've got an English commentary, we can see enough to know what was there. Quite often there'll be diagrams, there'll be pictures of copies of flip charts, or there'll be a PowerPoint or something, or their working notes, and we can see what was happening in whatever language. If they're doing right the way through to the master's level, then they have to do a significant case study piece of research, 12,000 words. So we're actually assessing them for their research skills as well. That's necessary for the university masters. It's increasingly expected now by ITAA and IATA as well that practitioners know about research, and they know how to interpret it and use it. And then, of course, if they go on to the CTA, then it's 24,000 words. It's made up of a self-portrayal, something about their learning, a case study, and some theory questions. Now, if they've done the masters, they've got enough. They can cut and paste it in a different format, but they've got enough to do that as well. And that's followed by an oral exam with a panel of 4. And in fact, the master's level will also be followed with something like that, like a form of a Viva. So that's what I'm looking for to help people, you know, if they want the qualification, these are the sorts of things they have to do. It's all evidence-based. It's all go out there, learn TA, use it to help other people grow, show us some evidence that you've done that, and that's how you get a qualification. Now, normally I would have been able to stop through this and take questions and so on, and now normally I would take questions, but of course we can't do that. I hope you found that useful. I know someone is going to collect up any questions and hopefully send them to me and I can answer them. Sorry that it will be in English. I look forward to hearing from some of you at least of what you think, how this compares to what you're used to, any ideas and so on would be great. I'm assuming you'll get this PowerPoint anyway, so there are the references that I've used as I've gone through. And then here are the details of how you can get in touch with me if you want to. Plus the reference for the TA Research Journal, if you don't already know about it, because I'm the editor, and it's free to everyone. It is in English. There are translated abstracts in Spanish. And I also run what are called the TA Proficiency Awards, where people go and teach TA to children, teachers, parents, and so on. And then we have a process where we give them a badge and a certificate. So encouraging getting TA out there. If any of those interest you, you're very welcome to contact me. And that is the end of the session. So I'll say goodbye, and I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to hearing from some of you at least, and maybe meeting you, because I am due to come to the conference in Brazil next year. So goodbye.